Welcome, everyone, to the Ecopsychology Café. This is a virtual forum for folks interested in ecopsychology and ecotherapy to discuss the relevant topics of our time. Hello, my name is Carol Koziel, and I'm the founder of the Canadian Ecopsychology Network, the host of this program. Monica Dragoza and I co-created this series. Today, Craig Chalquist will introduce the theme of eco-knowing through imagination, story, and folklore. And then we'll open it up for a general conversation. Dr. Craig Chalquist is a professor, author, and consultant who writes and teaches at the intersection of psyche, story, and imagination. Craig's a former associate provost at Pacifica Graduate Institute and former full professor in the Department of East-West Psychology at the California Institute of Integral Studies. He has designed and launched no less than 40 psychology, philosophy, mythology, and ecotherapy courses for both grad and undergrad students. Craig earned his PhD in depth psychology and his master's in marriage and family therapy, which he practiced for 9 years. He is currently working on another PhD in the philosophy, cosmology, and consciousness program at CIIS. Thanks so much, Craig and Monica, for sharing your time and wisdom with us today. And now, Craig, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Carol and Monica, and all of you for being here for this. I'm going to present for maybe 15 or 20 minutes, and then we can have some discussion after that, which I'm looking forward to. Also, I received a couple of questions in advance too, so I'm going to try to work them in as I go, and if there's any left when I get to the end, I'll just deal with those at that point. So because of the threads I want to pull together, at least a little bit in the time that I have, which is story, a little bit of folklore, imagination, and ecopsychology. I'd like to begin with a story, since we're going to be talking about that, a very brief one, a personal anecdote. And this one begins actually about, I'm going to guess about 1.5 years ago, when I was sitting thinking about what I've been doing vocationally for some time now, and the fact that I've done it with different roles, whether that's as an ecopsychologist or as a faculty member, an administrator in higher ed, and so on and so forth, a psychotherapist at one point. And I remember thinking, what is it that I really do? Reminds me of that question. If you've ever seen that film Office Space, there's a consultant that asks this guy, what would you say you do here, right? So I was trying to answer that. And it occurred to me that whatever I do, I always work somehow with story, which I'll define really simply as an imaginative account of a series of events that are connected with each other. And usually there's a sort of cause-effect connection, not in any formal philosophical sense, just there's a bunch of things that happen that relate to each other. These things maybe cause those things. So I'm using story in that sense, but I'm also using it in the sense as a framework of meaning for ourselves and how we understand our place in the world and each other. So my story is that when I finally realized that story was so central to what I was doing, I began to be more, not just more conscious of it, but to actually be more upfront about that professionally. And so since then, I've been working with that, and it's also led me into more doctoral work. And so for this piece, what I wanted to do is give you a little bit of a glimpse at what I'm focusing on right now. It's still kind of in flux. So I'm borrowing things that I've done before in terms of working on my dissertation and acquiring new things to weave them together with. So we'll see how that goes. And I'm trying to keep a spirit of play with all this. Somebody I worked with, Amanda Leach, likes to talk about playing attention, and I really like that phrase. So I'm going to try to play attention a little bit here. So stories to me matter for many reasons. They probably matter to everybody here, but I wanted to mention that part of what I'm looking into is research on how powerful story and storytelling is. And when you put it up against something like giving people facts, and these days since we're in a state of planetary crisis, often the facts are really depressing. And it's stuff we need to know, no question about that. when you do it with straight up data, facts, information, and all that, it tends to stick less. People remember stories better. When we scan people's brains, when they're either storytelling or listening to stories, more of the brain lights up, more emotions are involved. There is more of a sense of joining the storyteller in common imaginal ground, and more about that word imaginal in a second. Less opposition usually. Storytelling can build trust in some ways. There's lots of reasons to prefer it over straight up accounts and reports and things like that. So it's important for all those reasons, but I think it's important too, and this is what I'm looking in on for my dissertation. Stories are the way we make sense of things. When you think about who you are as a person, chances are you can pretty easily express it in the form of a story of some kind. And we talk about our personal stories. Sometimes we talk about personal myth, that kind of thing, the biography behind our biography. When we think about how we relate to each other, who the different people are in our worlds, different cultural backgrounds, things like that, oftentimes it takes the form of some kind of a story that we tell ourselves. So I've started using the term keystone stories for those stories, whether they're conscious or unconscious, whether they're elaborate or short, by which we navigate through the world. And so the insight that I had going back over my own career and my work is that somehow or other I've always been involved in looking at keystone stories, helping people reshape them if they need reshaping, or even replacing them with new stories. So where that concerns us here is that imagination, which is part of storytelling, whether we do it publicly or whether we're just telling our own story about how things are on this planet, imagination has a very long tradition of being a form of knowing, a form of wisdom. And one line of it, which I'm tracing in my doctoral work right now, goes back to ancient Egypt. And it shows up in many different forms. It's in Egyptian religion itself. But by 3rd century Alexandria, it starts to become known in the form of Hermeticism, which is a philosophical path of mind, body, spirit. And there's this deep layer of reverence for Earth and cosmos built into that. And this tradition of knowing through imagination moves forward through time, and we can see it show up in different forms here and there. So alchemy is one form, not just the attempt to make gold out of lead, but an actual wisdom tradition also coming out of Egypt. Alchemy is technical Hermeticism. We can see it in the European Romantic poets and philosophers. It's huge in depth psychology, especially Jung's variety of it. And when you read Jung, you'll see many places where he gives a nod to different Hermetic philosophers and forms of Hermeticism down the centuries. Shows up in a lot of other places too. Spiritual ecology is another one. Also Islamic spirituality, especially on the Sufi side. So common to all of these, and I could mention others, the European Renaissance as well. Imagination isn't seen as just something that's an add-on for entertainment. It's seen as a basic way of knowing how things are, knowing what's going on in the world, and also putting together our ideas about all of this and then talking to each other about that. So imaginal is a term that was coined by a scholar, Henri Corbin. He was studying Sufi mysticism, and he wanted imaginal to be a term that is a bit of a counterpart to imagination. I tend to like both terms, but his thought on this was that there are forms of knowledge that come through the imagination that isn't just us making stuff up, that it has its own kind of reality. So we're going from story to the imagination of how stories work and the degree of imagination in them. And as part of this, I wanted to mention folklore as a way of imaginatively and imaginally understanding our place in the world. So for some time, I've been teaching different kinds of folklore and from the perspective of what can it tell us, both about how to relate to the natural world, but also mistakes that we're making, ways that we should not be relating to the natural world. And these stories come up from around the world. All cultures have them. And I'm using folklore as a sort of umbrella term. So folklore includes mythology, as it's called in the West. Other people just call it traditional stories or sacred stories. Fairy tales, folk tales, legends, the whole bag, right? I've tended to work a lot with mythology, but I've now branched out into other things too, because there's so much in them that says something important about the natural world that we've tended to forget, particularly in our culture, which is busy eating the natural world rather than tending to it. So some examples of this, and then to finish, I want to talk a little bit about a term called world reading, which is actually the term I've now come to for the work that I do, and the orientation I work from. So in many different cultures, to give you a few examples from folklore, there are beings who hold up the world, on their shoulders, sometimes like Atlas, but some cultures say that there's 4 brothers or there's 4 sisters, or the Athapascan cultures talk about the old woman underneath us who supports everything. A lot of us have heard about Turtle Island, the continent that we live on. Elephants holding up the world in Hindu stories. And what's interesting to me about this recurring mythological image and folkloric image is that there's this feeling to it that the world isn't dead. It's not just matter, but that there's something animated and alive that supports the whole world. So that's something to perhaps take from these stories. And there are many other examples of those too. There are also examples of stories of the disaster that happens when we knock down one of those supporting structures or beings. So in China, a lot of people grow up with the story of Nuwa, who we could think of as a sort of wisdom and creator goddess who has to save all of us because a monster named Gong Gong headbutts a sacred mountain and he knocks the whole sky down and the sky turns black. So there are times when I was living in the Bay Area and the fires were burning up there, the wildfires, and we would go outside and the sky was black, gray, red, whatever it was. And I thought about that ancient story a lot. I thought this gives that story a new meaning in some ways, And it made me ask my students, where is Nuwa among us now? How will we get the sky back up where it belongs? So as is often the case in folklore, it doesn't think literally, it doesn't propose literal solutions to problems. It thinks more symbolically and it deals with recurrent situations. So when these stories first evolved, there were other things going on, obviously, besides climate change. But it's part of the flexibility and creativity of folklore that oftentimes it continues to be relevant down the generations. There is nature wisdom in old tales that actually do focus, sometimes kind of literally, on things like when is a good time to plant, like some of the Greek myths do. There are Aboriginal Australian stories that have to do with where kangaroos like to be and where they don't, things like that. So there's often, as Sean Kane points out in his book, Wisdom of the Myth Tellers, there are often inside these old folk tales and fairy tales and myths some ecological wisdom that applies to the places where the stories come from that's important to know about. Also, some of these nature figures have to do with situations that are so broad and so big that they actually go beyond the origin places of the original tellings. So during this COVID pandemic, that of course is still going on in many places, I was thinking at one point about the word pan in pandemic, and of course it goes back to Pan, the nature god. And when you look at the imagery associated with Pan, there are some kind of eerie parallels symbolically and thematically to things that happened during the pandemic, I think. Pan was in the practice, for instance, of where he lived up in Arcadia. He would hang out behind trees and bushes, and when people walked by, he would jump out and scare them all of a sudden, which is where we get the word panic. So during the worst of the pandemic, I was wondering, what is it that Pan is trying to tell us about how we're relating to the natural world? Is there a warning there, a message there? There's some speculation that this pandemic itself started with bats, and so there's that whole machinery of how we treat other animals, including them. And bats, of course, in mythology are often associated with the underworld. So what are the bats? What is Pan? What are they warning about us? And when we look at how we live on this planet, it's pretty easy to see why they would be upset, looking through a mythological lens. I wanted to mention, too, a couple of examples of folk tales, both collected by the Brothers Grimm. And they remind me of contemporary practices that we sometimes talk about within ecopsychology itself. So there's a story called The Queen Bee, and it involves an anthill, some ducks, and a beehive that are actually mentors to the protagonist in the story. And often the protagonist in these stories is somebody who is a cast out person, a brother who is oppressed by his older brothers, people like this, right? But in this case, those three aspects of the natural world are mentors to the protagonist. And we see this in many stories. If you can think of all the stories you were told maybe in childhood where trees could speak or ants could say something or whatever. Today we might call that words like learning from terms like learning from the natural world, or forms of ecotherapy, that kind of thing. And in terms of the ants, by the way, oftentimes here in California during the summer, I'm reminded of the fact that ants do speak if we can understand their language a bit. And so when we have heat waves out here, and I saw this a lot in the Bay Area, which is a little bit north of where I am right now, but I would go out walking and maybe there would be a sidewalk where the ants were just pouring across it. And I always knew that within 2 days, we would have a huge heat wave. The ants knew it before we did. So when I hear stories about ants talking, I think about that, right? It's still possible to hear their language. Some of us do it all the time. And then there's another story I'll mention, The Grateful Beasts. And this one's another one of those oppressed protagonists, this young guy who gets injured by his older brothers. And at one point, he's been beat up very badly. He's laying on the ground. He's even been blinded. And he hears some crows talking. And one of the crows says, "Isn't it too bad that he doesn't know that if he just drank the water from this lake over here, then he would be healed from his injuries, his broken bones. And if he just put some of the dew from the hillside in his eyes, then he would be able to see again." So of course he does those things. But for me, the interesting part of the story is that he collects some of this water, this healing water, and he then uses that to heal a wolf, a mouse, and a bee. And this reminds me of Howard Kleinbell's idea of the ecological circle, that when we do ecotherapy, it's not just about taking or mining healing from the natural world, but it's also about giving something back. It's about being in a relationship. So those are a few examples of many, many, many examples of folklore telling us ways to be with the rest of the natural world, ways we shouldn't be. I want to mention too that there's a whole tradition actually within Christianity itself called the Book of Nature. It goes back before St. Augustine. And it's the idea that there are aspects of the natural world that are symbolic, that we can interpret, that we can speak to. And so from this perspective, and it includes, when we go forward in time, it includes transcendentalism, American transcendentalism, and other perspectives too. Then from this point of view, we're actually in this great conversation that transcends our species, and that we can enter at any moment on a conscious level if we learn enough humility to actually listen to languages that are not familiar to us, but that we can still respond to. So one last bit about world reading, and then I think I've answered some of the questions I received before this. I'll get to a couple of other ones too. So world reading is the term I use for, and it's what I'm doing my doctoral work on as well. What's a good way of saying this? I've been using psychology and ecopsychology as a wisdom path for a long time, and at some point I decided that I wanted to experiment with actually using it openly philosophically as a psycho-spiritual path. So when I think about world reading, I think about all those ways that we can look at the symbolism of the world, that the world's speaking to us all the time, and it speaks through story, it speaks through the stories that we tell about it. And when you think about the origins of things like folk tales and myths, if you go back far enough, there's no perceived split between us and the rest of nature or us and the rest of the world. So, of course, the characters out there are also the characters in the story. It makes sense from that perspective. Is there a way in which we can pick up that thread and re-participate in that conversation? So I'm curious about that. And then one other thing I'll mention about it, there's a term I've been using for some time called enchantativism, which is part of this package. And enchantativism comes from me noticing that a lot of my activist colleagues, friends, a couple of my partners have been activists, were suffering severe burnout. And of course, activism, environmental activism is risky. It's dangerous at times. It's hard to do that work, very hard, to protect the rights that we still have, for instance. And so I was thinking of what part could those of us do who weren't such heroes, who wanted to have a good effect on things in a different way, because we don't feel called to be activists, or perhaps we feel called to be that in a more storytelling mode. So I started looking for examples of how people do this all the time. And I'm thinking of things like, there's this group called Incredible Edible, and it's a group of women in the UK who started just openly growing vegetables in their yards and telling everybody, just have some, right? Very simple. And now it's spread all over the place. And one of the people who does this says that there's only one rule for joining this club. If you're hungry, eat. That's it, right? I have a friend who is designing a dance project. She has a long history of doing disco in different ways. She ran a dance club in Iran for a while where disco is really big. And she decided that disco is actually a spiritual activity if it's held a certain way, a spiritual activity that's fun. And so she's humorously starting to promote this as a sort of religious activity. Like, you can be in our religion if you like to dance, no sacred books, no clergy, nothing like that, right? So I could mention other examples too. I think whenever we speak to possibilities, whenever we acknowledge the ruptures and injustices and just plain bad news that we all are faced with, but then we make the additional move of asking, but how could things be? And where are they actually working? Then we move in the direction of what I'm calling enchantativism. And I can give you some other examples too. So more and more as I get older, I'm more interested in what pulls me forward and what inspires me, rather than what shames me and makes me feel bad. And not that there's a certain amount of that that's not perhaps necessary and salutary, but after a point it starts to get counterproductive. So instead of pushes from behind, I'm more and more interested in the stories and the images and the actions that pull us forward into futures that we can imagine together, the kind that would actually delight us. So I think that's about where I'm going to stop. And I think I've actually Oh, there's one question I didn't quite answer, which was, or a couple of them. So what happens when stories and folklore become outdated? Well, they certainly do, right? Most of the folklore that we have in the world, particularly from Europe, is patriarchal. Um, you have to kind of look below the surface to see the symbolism in it, but it still is, you know. And so it seems like what needs to happen is that the stories, and people are doing this, they get reinvented. So one of the things I ask my students to do when they look at, for instance, let's say Greek and Roman myths, which are a very small part of the world's mythology, I ask them, who are the outcast characters? Who are the demonized characters in these stories? And what if you wrote a story about them? What would they have to say? And people are doing this. In India, I learned I was taking a mythology certificate at Oxford online. And there's a group of people in India who are reimagining the story of Sita, who's held up as this feminine, passive figure who does whatever men tell her. And they're making her more of an earth goddess and celebrating her that way. So there's lots of examples around the world of reinterpreting the tales or even making up new ones. So I can say more about that if there's other questions. But I think particularly during times of turbulence and chaos, it's important that we have stories that move us forward together. So I think I'll stop there and we can do some Q&A discussion. How about that?
Super, thanks, Craig. Monica, you want to help facilitate here?
Yeah, and what I just wanted to say is what we wanted to try today was having people, unless you really feel strongly about asking your question in person, so to speak, that you would pop it into the chat, and just for the reason that we can keep the recording going for longer and just have a longer recording and have more people watching the recording benefit from your questions. So please feel free to start popping your questions and comments into the chat. And maybe in the meantime, Craig, did you want to talk about a couple of your books, your recent books, like what you were mentioning earlier?
Yeah, and let me type one in. Sorry, I have to type without talking because I'm not good at doing both. There's a book some of you may have heard of that got published in 2020 called Terrapsychological Inquiry. It was an effort. I published it, but I had a lot of excerpts from former students who did this work. And we were looking for an earth-honoring way to do research, particularly qualitative and story-based. So I wanted to mention that as a resource that's out there. And I also wanted to mention that the book is being translated into Mandarin this year and published in China. So if you know anybody who wants to read it that way, or if you do yourself, that's going to be available. And the publisher asked me this morning if I wanted to do a second edition, because I guess it's doing well for the publisher. So there'll be eventually a second edition. So we'll have to see about that. Oh, one other thing. There's a book coming out also this year, and it's called Terrapsychology, and has a subtitle after it. But this one is a whole bunch of voices. It's not just me writing it. So that book is going to be published by Taylor and Francis later in the year. We just gave the publisher everything. And this one is different ways of looking at the animate nature of everything, basically, even indoors, even buildings, streets, stuff like that, as well as the natural world, and being part of that great conversation I mentioned earlier. So that's coming out as well.
That's great. And I'll just hold up Craig's book that I have a copy of, Terrapsychological Theory. And I just want to say that, I mean, I felt a bit sheepish saying to you, Craig, that I've been using it for personal reasons, because I know that for you, there's scholarship involved in terrapsychological inquiry, and I hope that it can be applied on a collective level. But I've just been finding it really helpful looking at an intergenerational transmission in my family that's quite strong, and that approaching it from the place, approaching that inquiry from the place where I live with my family has been incredibly powerful. So I just thought I would say that.
Oh, thank you. I've been trying to move back and forth between academia and the real world for a number of years. And I feel like I'm moving more and more toward the real world. So we'll see if that continues. But one of the things I mentioned there is there's part of my training is in family systems as a psychotherapist, and so I've noticed oftentimes that there are element themes that show up in people's families. So to take one of my own as an example, I'm adopted and also know my birth families. So there's this really strong theme of fire running all the way down through my birth father's side of the family. And when I told him I set my high school on fire once because I was being picked on by bullies, and that was my response, he said, well, it kind of runs in the family. I've set things on fire, blown things up, this, that. He said our ancestors burned Rome up at one point, and I was like, wow, that's way more impressive than a high school. So there's that theme on one side of the family. And then on my birth mother's side is water. Everybody is a sailor. The family name Murdoch means sea warrior. We're coast people from Scotland, among other places. So it's when you understand a family that way as these big archetypal images playing with each other, it's really not surprising, for instance, that my birth parents didn't stay together. Their marriage was a mix of fire and water. So that's a very simple example, but what would happen if we looked at things like, what's our relationship to nature ancestrally, right? Going all the way back. I did some genetic testing a while ago, and they provided me with a map that went back about 70,000 years. So it showed the original exit of my ancestors from East Africa and then all the way north and around and all that. And what intrigued me was, and this may be an example of symbolic thinking and world reading, the path of my ancestors made a huge question mark across part of the world. And I thought, that's really interesting. I wonder where we go from here. So.
That's so neat. Yeah. So we've got quite a few questions in now. So we'll start with them. And just to remind people, if you want to ask your question in person, we'll do that at the end when we stop the recording. But so one question is, how do you maintain a state of heaven on earth within your soul?
My soul doesn't feel heavenly sometimes. It's always not nice when it does. And you know what I'm going to do is work in something that I forgot to answer in terms of previous questions. So part of it is, I think it's really important to have spaces where you can just be alone with some aspect of the natural world. And you might be able to hear cars going by on the freeway outside. So it's not like I live out in a backwoods somewhere, but even a little bit helps. And I always take time every single day to have space that way. I always express gratitude toward everything every single day as a practice. So things like that to help not only be grounded, but there's a better word that just went out of my brain. I think somehow connected to Earth in a conscious way, and that helps me. And sometimes I just don't feel it. I feel fragmented, or there's a lot going on in my life, and I do my best, So one thing that's kind of more recent in my life over the last several years, I was asked about psychedelics. So I'm going to say something very brief about that. When I started to work in the Bay Area, a lot of my students were interested in those practices, and I had no experience with that, and I asked why, and then I had a dream that was full of mushrooms, and I shared that with somebody who's an expert on psychedelics, and he said, that's really the way to go into this, is if you get called by something, not if you're just playing or experimenting or whatever, So I was curious about it. And one of the things I learned was that in some ways I'm learning to think of mycelia and a lot of different medicines as emissaries of the natural world. In a way, they speak very directly to us when we're in those states of communion with them, depending on all kinds of circumstances. But that was one of the takeaways for me, that psychedelics are definitely not for everybody, and one should be safe with them. But if you're in the hands of somebody who knows what they're doing, they can be yet another channel to kind of hearing the inside story about what's happening, especially where you are when you do the journey. So that's a very brief bit. I'm not here to advocate for them or anything like that. I think they're one form of contact among many and that people can make use of.
That's wise. Yeah. So someone else is asking if what you're talking about with us today relates to the different sides of the brain. And
Uh,
they've referenced that they're trying to fathom British philosopher / neurology expert Ian McGilchrist's work on how our over-reliance on left brain thinking is crippling us.
I think it fits with that. I'm familiar with some of his work, and one of the things he mentions is that there's this craze that we went through a while back where we went, oh, it's left brain, or it's right brain, it's this and that, as though they don't talk to each other, you know. But he's a psychiatrist with a lot of neurology background, and he has reawakened interest in this idea of how differently the hemispheres process information. And so part of what he emphasizes is that we tend to be a left brain culture. And I think literalism is part of that. Like when we look at stories that come from a long time ago and we reduce them to a literal meaning or a formula, that's, in his terms, that would be the left hemisphere dominating the conversation. So where I go with that tends to be sort of in a, what's a good way of saying this? I like some of his work, and I also think of it in symbolic terms, like not just in terms of hemispheres, but there's that bridge that connects them, the corpus callosum, which from one angle looks like a bird with its wings outstretched. So my imagination tends to go with that, you know, like how does stretching our wings help us experience all this as whole people, you know?
Sure. Someone here is very thankful for your work. They ask how you get so creative and if you've experienced any near-death experiences or spiritual awakenings to evolve you to this level. And it sounds like they have a question for you that maybe they want to reach out to you on your
Yeah.
website. But
Sure, that's fine. I'd love to hear from you. I think part of tending imagination is being open to the idea that creativity is something we all do, and that there's no distinction between creative people and those that aren't. And I actually got a lesson in this from my dad when he was still around. He was a very literal-minded, bottom-line guy, and when I started studying things like ecopsychology and depth psychology, he wanted to know how it's going to pay the bills, which is a conversation a lot of us have had with family members, right? And I said, I don't know. My intuition tells me this is the path I need to go down, and I'm going to trust it, right? And so that worked. And then when he saw that I was actually making money from teaching, he went, oh, okay, that's good, you know. So it's tempting to think of people like my dad as just being unimaginative and uncreative. And he spent most of his life in jobs he hated. And I kind of joked with him about that a little bit, although I think it might have been painful for him and I probably shouldn't have done it. But I asked him at one point, why are you giving me advice about ending up in jobs as miserable as the ones that you've had, you know? And well, it pays the bills, you know. So by day he worked in insurance and numbers and money because he thought he was a business guy. He wasn't. And so what cued me in was on the weekends and evenings, he would spend time in his workshop. And he ended up having 6 of them on a relatively small property. He was a handyman. He was into making stuff. And after he died, I went into one of his shops that I hadn't been in a while. And there were all these half-completed projects, wiring and circuits and wood that he was crafting and stuff like that. And I went, this is where his imagination was. He was very creative. It was just compartmentalized from the rest of his life. So part of what I try to do is be creative in just the little things that I do and hope that that kind of transfers to other stuff. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. But
someone was asking if you could mention again who was the person who, I guess, used or coined the term imaginal?
Yeah, Henry Corbin. So I'll type his name in. Henri is how it's pronounced, actually. Henri Corbin. a French scholar who worked a lot in the realm of, it's called Sufi mysticism, but I think Gnosticism is actually a more accurate term. He works a lot with these disciplines as paths of imagination, imagination as a form of spiritual knowing, and his work is really amazing.
Nice. Okay, so another question. What might a process to growing more humility to listen to the languages of nature look like?
Hmm. To me, it seems like having that cue about nature being able to speak symbolically can help. So some years ago, I taught for a week at Schumacher College in England, and I took some students out on Dartmoor, and at one point we formed a circle, and I did an imagination exercise with them, and I said, okay, we've been out here all afternoon looking at this place, the rock formations, this, that. I want you to switch your perception a little bit and imagine that the place is observing you and it's witnessing you, and to try to get a sense of what it thinks of you, thinks in quotes, you know. So we were there maybe 10 seconds, standing in a circle, and this big raven flew in, and it flew a perfect slow circle over our heads, relatively close, and it cawed one time, and it flew off. And so we all just stood there for a minute silently. And then I said to the students, what do you make of that? And the consensus was that the place had said hello to us, that it somehow appreciated the fact that we were out there. So at that point, even the people who were very skeptical of the exercise were in at least a temporary state of awe. So I think being open to things like that, for me, humility and open-mindedness go together. When we think we're sure we know something, then we're not in the place of humility and we stop learning.
Yeah, humility and curiosity. Yeah.
Mm.
How have you related or seen others relate nature or folklore to their experience of being queer / trans, etc.? What messages do you think nature and folklore
Yeah.
have around this topic?
Yeah, great question. So I'm going to, in the interest of time, I'm going to give one example. So in that book, Terrapsychological Inquiry, there are a couple of different people who look at the queer relationship with the natural world through various lenses. C.K. Olivieri was a student of mine who did a whole study on queer spaces in places like San Francisco. And what is it about the place itself that feels like a haven, right? And I'm thinking specifically of Kevin Filacamo, who also did master's research on this. And he had this really intense experience when he was out walking of being completely penetrated by a mountain that he was walking on as a presence, as this overwhelming presence for him. And he went, what is this? I've never had an experience like that. And so he ended up making that a jumping off point for his master's project. So those are a couple of examples.
Somebody here wanting to know if there's an online group that has ongoing discussions of mythological stories that can carry us forward in turbulent times.
Not that I know of. There is a terrapsychology group that meets once a month. So if you contact me, I can tell you about that group.
Okay.
There's about a dozen people that meet. I had to miss some of the meetings because of my school schedule, but it meets regularly.
Okay. I think we've actually made it through most of the questions in the chat. Well, somebody's wanting to know how we contact you. We can get to that at the end. I guess I'm wondering if we should open it up if anybody wants to make a verbal comment or ask a verbal question at this point. Carol, what do you think?
Sure. I'll stop the recording now.
I'll just ask, I always do this when we do online meetings of different kinds. If you have a comment or question, please come right to the point. Sometimes we get caught up in the importance of what we're saying and we go on for a while and there's kind of limited time. So